It just so happened that the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century marked a time of flourishing works in the fantasy genre. Placing their heroes in a quasi-medieval world, most authors didn't overthink it, equipping them with rather pompous weapons like swords. However, there were also those who used something more exotic. This, in turn, sparked the reader's interest and a desire to learn more about various curiosities, their properties, and features. But the trouble is that medieval chroniclers were not known for contemplating the shapes of blades or the advantages and disadvantages of different types of cold weapons. If even the name of a weapon appears in a battle description, it is already seen as a find for historians and weapon experts. Those who could truly reflect on this topic, such as weaponsmiths, passed their knowledge from master to apprentice and, in a competitive environment, were not eager to share it left and right. Fighters who, in the late Middle Ages, delved into the study of fencing, established schools, and wrote fencing manuals, focusing mainly on practice rather than theory. As a result, this created a situation where the growing interest in various types of cold weapons had little to satisfy it. But, as we know, nature abhors a vacuum, and the internet quickly filled up with a plethora of articles about weapons. Most often the pattern was that one author would present their sound, and sometimes not so sound ideas, while a dozen others would copy them with slight modifications. This also applied to the specimen we're discussing today, the glaive or glaive-like weapon. Its spread in Europe is associated with the 14th century, when the first mentions and images of this weapon began to appear. The peak of its popularity falls in the 15th century. It's important to note that we're talking about its spread, not its appearance. The situation is more complex when it comes to the emergence of the glaive. The thing is, the glaive refers to a combination of a single-edged blade, usually up to 60 centimeters long, and a shaft, the size of which varied greatly. Part of the shaft, as well as the opposite end, was typically reinforced with metal. The blade usually had a curve and a generally quite straight back. Essentially, it was something like a falchion mounted on a shaft. It's important to note that a key feature of the glaive was the projection, a sharp spike on the back. This spike could be positioned either perpendicular to the blade or at an angle, which was much more common. If this projection resembled a long branch, such a weapon was called a guisarme. If there were no projections or branches at all, we're talking about an item known as a kusza or sovnya among the Slavs. The essence is that the spear was probably humanity's oldest weapon. By the Middle Ages, there were already countless forms of tips. It's hard to say who was the first to make long, single-edged blade tips. It's easier to understand why the peak popularity of this weapon falls precisely in the 14th to 15th centuries. The fact is that in the developed Middle Ages, the primary military force in Europe was knightly cavalry. By the 12th century, knights were already well protected by chainmail, which was later replaced by plate armor, and by the end of the 14th century, full plate armor became common. However, during this same period of development, cities were emerging, which some monarchs saw as a political tool, counterbalancing the influence of powerful feudal lords. As a result, the Magdeburg Law emerged. Without going into details, from the 13th century, several cities in Europe gained independence and began to live by their own laws. Additionally, there were groups like the Swiss. Their social structure stood out from the broader political landscape of Europe. Despite feudalism, they retained communities and communal lands, meaning they were free peasants. They were invested in maintaining this status and were even willing to defend it with weapons in hand. By the 13th to 14th centuries, new players emerged in the socio-political landscape of Europe. Naturally, military force was needed for participation in this process. Heavy cavalry is great, but a war horse and armor are not cheap. Since most knights were landowners and were supported by numerous villages located on their lands, they could afford expensive equipment. However, it seems that equipping thousands of cavalrymen was beyond the means of cities or Swiss peasantry. Everyone understood that infantry would need to face these cavalrymen. The solution to this problem was the use of polearm weapons, pikes, halberds, glaives, and the like. It's difficult to stop a horse or reach a mounted knight with an axe, sword, or mace. However, for example, fewer than 2,000 Swiss infantry armed with polearms defeated Austrian forces at the Battle of Morgarten in 1315, which were roughly 5 times larger, including at least as many mounted knights as there were Swiss. At the Battle of Nancy in 1477, the Swiss infantry defeated what was considered by some to be the best cavalry in Europe, the Burgundian Knights. History is filled with similar examples. However, it would be a mistake to believe that the main reason for their success lay solely in the use of pikes, halberds, and other similar types of weaponry. The infantry pike is a simple weapon, yet for some reason, it became an effective tool against cavalry only relatively late. The essence of the infantry's success lay not only in their weaponry, but also in their organization, discipline, and a new formation that emerged in the 13th century, known as the battalia. However, since today's discussion focuses on weapons, it's worth noting that in different parts of the world, people arrived at similar solutions for addressing comparable challenges. For example, in ancient China, where infantry and cavalry were actively used in constant wars between kingdoms, and where nomads from the steppes occasionally arrived with less than friendly intentions, there existed a weapon known as the guan. This single-edged broad blade on a shaft, like the glaive, sometimes featured projections on the back. Its origins are dated to the 3rd century, making it roughly 1,000 years older than its European counterpart. One must also mention the Japanese naginata, known since around the 7th century. The shape of the blade differs somewhat, but overall it continues the same idea. In essence, something similar existed among many peoples. However, when it comes to Europe, the glaive, and the late Middle Ages, there's a certain dissonance. The thing is, if we look at the evolution of such a popular polearm as the halberd, a clear trend emerges. Early examples with long blades are replaced by models with shorter ones. The area of the cutting surface decreases, and a pointed, often faceted tip emerges. This is linked to the development of knightly armor, which effectively resisted contact with long cutting edges. However, if we look at glaives, we see that they only became somewhat larger. It's clear that a long, curved blade is capable of slicing through soft materials well, but against protective gear, such a blade is not the best solution. It's more effective to thrust with the pointed tip of a halberd, and it's also more convenient to pull a rider off their mount with it. Given this context, one might wonder why the glaive was needed in the 15th century, especially since its blade shape and properties resemble those of earlier halberds from the 13th century, or even polearms like the berdiche, differing only in their mounting system. In Japan during the 14th century, where armor did not undergo as radical a change as in Europe, naginatas became shorter and adopted a straighter blade. With the glaive, it seems that the weapon didn't really respond to the enhancement of protective gear at all. This suggests that overcoming armor, or even striking less protected joints, which became harder to reach, was not the primary objective of this weapon. I might be called a knacker, but in my opinion, much like the berdiche, the long, curved blade of the glaive was superbly suited for targeting not the rider, but their horse. The projection on the back and the sharp spike, which was often positioned at an angle, likely allowed the wielder to catch or block the strikes of a cavalryman. It's important to understand that battle is a collective endeavor, and while one person holds off a knight's weapon, their comrades in formation are probably raining blows down on both the knight and their horse. This doesn't imply that the glaive is merely a secondary, useless weapon in combat that cannot harm a knight or another infantryman. However, striking a fully armored knight is more effectively done with weapons like the halberd, the lucerne hammer, or the very inexpensive and easy-to-produce Gutentag. A sufficiently wide, long, and curved blade is most dangerous against opponents with minimal armor, and there were likely few of those on the battlefields of 15th century Europe. Glaives were sometimes used to arm, for example, Burgundian crossbowmen. This brings to mind a certain analogy with the later gunners. I doubt that the gunners could effectively confront the cavalrymen directly, but striking the legs of the horses to create chaos is quite possible. In individual duels using the glaive, the focus could be on targeting the legs, arms, or performing sweeps. The opposite end of the shaft, often reinforced with metal and featuring a steel spike, was perfectly suitable for finishing off opponents. Samples where the spike on the back was perpendicular could be used for piercing armor and unseating the rider, although I have my doubts about such uses of this weapon. Overall, the fact that the evolution of the glaive changed little at the turn of the 14th and 15th centuries during the rise of plate armor suggests that the primary target of this weapon was likely not the rider, but rather his horse. But these are just my thoughts, not claiming to be the ultimate truth. Constructive and reasoned criticism in the comments is welcome.